Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 15, The Lost City of Cahokia. Cahokia was the largest pre-Columbian city in North America, north of Mexico, a sophisticated metropolis built by the Mississippians, whose network stretched across most of the eastern United States. However, when modern Americans talk about the native peoples that came before us, we rarely discuss the Mississippians and their great civilization. This is due in part to the fact that the city was already abandoned by the time the Europeans arrived, and also due to the fact that their great architectural achievements weren't made of stone like other lost civilizations, but rather were great earthworks. My guest today is Bill Iseminger, the assistant site manager of Cahokia Mounds. We talk about the history of the site, what life there would have been like, and we even cover how you can stretch your archaeology muscles by volunteering on a site dig. A quick note before we start the episode. This episode was the very first interview I ever did. Bill was the very first person to agree to come on the show, and I will be forever grateful to him. I love what he has to say, and I really think that more Americans should visit Cahokia, and so I want to make sure that this episode is out there for you all to hear. But it was the first episode I ever did, so please be kind. There are some audio quirks that I can't go back in time and fix. I wish I could. But when I say that I had audio issues, I mean I literally had my microphone turned around backwards. A few weeks after I recorded this episode with Bill, I did an episode of Chris Christensen's show called Amateur Traveler about travel to Sofia, Bulgaria, which you all should also do. And he pointed out to me, because we have the same microphone, that I was talking into my microphone backwards. And I definitely felt like an idiot. So despite the fact that I have sold software and I've taken computer programming classes, I'm not a technical person. My website, podcast, production, everything I outsource because I can't do any of it. So just be kind about the audio and know that, but it was recorded a long time ago, and hopefully since then I fixed a lot of the issues, and I know that there are still technical audio issues that we're working on, but just be kind. Okay, on to the interview. Good afternoon, everyone. I have with me William Iseminger. Bill is the assistant site manager of Cahokia Mounds in Illinois, and he's also in charge of their public relations. And I believe you've written quite extensively about it. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote about Cahokia?
Yeah, I guess it was 2010 it came out. It's called Cahokia Mounds, America's First City. And it's basically a descriptive book. A lot of my colleagues have written more theoretical approaches to Cahokia, but I wanted to do something that was more for the general public, and so it gives basic information.
Excellent. And how did you get started? What made you come to Cahokia as your profession?
Well, I had worked here on a dig back in 1968 as a shovel hand, basically, and I was going to graduate school down at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, Illinois. And I'd gone that following, I guess it was 1969, I went to an archaeology conference that was held here in Illinois for our Illinois archaeologists, and ran into my former supervisor who supervised my, the project I was working on here. And he asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm finishing up my master's, and I'm looking for a job. And he says, well, how'd you like to work at Cahokia? And I twist my arm, And so he'd been offered a job to work here through the Illinois State Museum, and he needed an assistant to work here as well. And so he was been looking, and I was available, and we'd had a good experience working together in the past. So this was 1971 that I officially started, and been here ever since.
Wow, so you've been working at Cahokia Mounds for over 45 years. Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's so exciting. Was there anything that you guys discovered on that first dig that was particularly interesting to you?
Well, the dig I was on was what we call the South Stockade. At one point in time, the the center part of the community here was enclosed by a log wall that was almost 2 miles long. And we were digging trying to find the southern part of it, and we were able to do that. And it was very difficult digging. It was very dense, heavy clay that we had to dig through. But we looked mainly for the discolorations in the soil that indicate where the people we call the Mississippians here had dug trenches in the ground in which they set posts to create this wall. And so that was the main purpose of our project. And we were able to find at least 3 different constructions of the wall in that particular area.
Oh, wow. Have you continued to do archaeology at the site over the years?
For a number of years, yeah. I then began to direct public field school programs. People from the general public could sign up for a 2-week session.
Oh, wow. Can you still go dig? If you're an amateur, can you still sign up to dig?
Yeah, we still do have those kinds of programs going on here. But I did that until the mid-1980s. And as we built our new museum here, my job duties started to change, and I wasn't able to do field work anymore, and mostly museum-related work and working with exhibits and the interpretation and interns and other kinds of public archaeology, I guess you'd say.
Oh, wow. Well, I think a 2-week vacation to Illinois to do some archaeology work sounds amazing, so I might think about that down the road. As far as Cahokia, so let's kind of take a step back and why don't you tell everyone what Cahokia is and a little bit about the beginning.
Okay, well, the sort of summarized Cahokia Mounds is the largest prehistoric Indian community in America, the largest north of Mexico, and at one time covered around 6 square miles, had around 120 mounds, and at its peak, maybe anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people living here. And its peak period was mostly between about 1050 to 1200 AD. And the culture they were part of, we call Mississippian, and it's sort of a generic term that we use for people that have certain types of artifacts and lifestyle that we see throughout the southeastern U.S. and up the Mississippi Valley. So it's really a lot of different tribes, speaking different languages, but doing things much the same way that we lump together under that term Mississippian. But this sort of the earliest large community, but there was a lot of interaction and trade with other areas. So we find evidence of a lot of seashell brought here from the Gulf of Mexico for creating beads and ornaments. We get copper from around Lake Superior. We're getting mica from the southern Appalachians. We're getting minerals and chert and flint from many sources throughout the Midwest. So they had a very extensive trade network. Our big point here is that we try to stress is the urban nature of Cahokia. And it didn't exist in a vacuum either. There were other smaller sites around it. In fact, there are other major mound centers in East St. Louis and St. Louis, all within about 8 miles of us. And then there are lots of smaller communities around all of these, so we kind of refer to that as Greater Cahokia.
Okay, so it's kind of like the big city in the middle of an urban metropolis. As far as the early I guess they weren't settlers, how do you guys refer to the people that started?
Well, in cultural traditions is the kind of term we use for the different ways of life that, like the earlier people that were living here, we call the late woodland. There were, several small settlements in the area, and eventually, something around 1000 AD, we start to see things changing. You start to see these larger, more permanent type communities. So there were always people here going back, 10,000 BC or so. So there, those were smaller groups, and that was back at the end of the Ice Age. But all the way up through, until 12,000 years almost, people were living in this area, but it really began to develop as an urban complex after 1000 AD.
Is there a reason that it became a larger city than anything else that we see in the United States during that time?
That's the question we have been pursuing for some time. Why Cahokia? Why not some of these other places? Part of its location. We're near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. So this was a major area for transportation and trade, along those river systems. Plus the soils laid down by these rivers were very important for agriculture. And it's really after about 900 AD that we see that corn comes into the diet as a major crop. And that's when we start to see a lot of these larger communities, more permanent communities developing. So, the resources were here. But for some reason, Cahokia outgrew all the others. Now, whether it was something that happened here, something about the location itself, or whether maybe there was a charismatic leader or somebody very powerful that drew people in. But all of a sudden, relatively sudden anyway, we start to see a lot of the smaller communities being abandoned and people moving in to be part of the bigger community here at Cahokia.
Oh, wow. So while Cahokia was in its heyday, which were the civilizations that were thriving in the rest of North America and South America?
Well, let's see, where Cahokia would be contemporary, I guess, with some of the Toltec and Huastecan cultures in Mexico. They were later than the Mayan and earlier than the Aztec, so sort of in between those cultural traditions. They probably knew something about each other, and there were probably occasional travelers, but we don't really see any real clear evidence of direct contact or migration or anything like that. So we don't have to look to Mesoamerica for explaining things happening here at Cahokia, but I still think that they were probably aware of each other.
As far as the actual city itself, when I was there, in my experience walking through and seeing the different mound systems and the wood hinge and the different, are we calling them pyramids? I don't remember what we specifically call them now, but just the different structures that are in the city. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what some of the most important ones are and what they were used for?
Okay, well, I mentioned there were 120 mounds, and actually some of the largest mounds for the Mississippian culture are here at Cahokia, including the one biggest one we call Monk's Mound, which covers about 14 acres at the base, and it's 100 feet high. And it's not only the largest mound here, it's the largest totally earthen mound that was built by ancient peoples in all of North or South America. So it's a massive structure. About 22 million cubic feet of earth are in that mound, and if you count all the other mounds, you could double that amount. Plus, a lot of other construction was going on here too. They created what we call the Grand Plaza, which covers about 40 acres, and they actually artificially built up and leveled that area in the center of the city, where they'd have their public gatherings and festivals and games and markets and other kinds of communal activities. And there are other plazas also throughout the city. So this is all dirt that's carried by hand, by basket load at a time, because they didn't have horses or wagons or carts to haul that dirt. So it was all done with human labor. Another major construction project was, I mentioned the stockade, this defensive wall that enclosed the central ceremonial precinct of Cahokia, or about the central 200 acres or so. It was built at least 4 times, and to build a wall like that would take about 15,000 to 20,000 logs each time, which means cutting down thousands of trees with stone axes, probably from several miles away, and then cutting all the limbs off, peeling the bark off, carrying, dragging, or floating them back here to Cahokia. Then they dug a trench in the ground about 1.5 feet wide and about 4 feet deep or so, in which they set the post. So the wall, stood probably above ground, about 10 or 12 feet high. So, and about every 90 feet along the wall, they had what we call bastions, like guard towers that would project outward, from which on raised platforms inside those, warriors could stand to shoot down on anybody attacking, or maybe catch them in a crossfire between the towers. So its primary purpose was a defensive structure in case they were ever attacked, but probably within their own society that had a social function, something different about who lived inside and who lived outside the walled area. Some kind of, we do see a lot more evidence of hierarchy and status in society during this Mississippian period than we had seen in earlier times. They also built circular arrangement of posts, called the wood hinge. Basically a sun circle. It was used like a calendar. And they built that at least 5 different times, and each time it had a different diameter, different number of posts. And for some reason, they were changing it. And I don't fully understand, but we do know that from central observation posts that there were alignments with outer posts on the circle at the equinoxes and the solstices. So it lined up with, the sunrises on those dates. Probably other posts probably marked other important dates in their calendar as well, their ritual calendar. It also enclosed a sacred space where they could have the ceremonies associated with that, calendar system. So those are some of the major site features, and we've reconstructed Woodhenge at its original location. We did the third one, which had 48 posts in a big circle that was about 410 feet in diameter. We've also reconstructed some segments of the stockade wall as well. And we have also erected steps to go to the top of Monk's Mound, the big mound, so that people visit. That's one of the main things they like to experience is, climbing to the top.
As far as the peoples that live there, what do we know about their religion?
Well, a lot of it's interpreted by what we know about what later Indians were doing, but also we look at the artifacts that we find, the symbols that we see, and these all give us clues. So Mississippian culture pretty much died out in the Midwest before 1400, but it does continue in the South. So when the Spaniards came into the South in the 1500s, they encountered people who were still living this Mississippian way of life, and a little bit later the French came in as well. So we have some ideas, based on what these later people were doing, but also we look at other, Indian cultures and their belief systems that we have some documentation for. So primarily, we believe that they believed probably in a creator, as many Indian people do, but also there are a lot of the forces of nature, like wind, the rain, the water, sun, the moon, the stars. All these things are parts of their spiritual worlds. And most Indians, and we believe that's true here too, believe in like 3 spiritual realms: the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. So various animals or creatures and colors and directions and other forces are associated with those different realms, and we see that represented in the artwork they do. Because even it's not art for art's sake. Usually the art will represent something to do with their spiritual beliefs too. So we see representations, for instance, of what we call a birdman figure. Sometimes it's depicted as a man wearing a bird-like mask with a beaked or hooked nose, holding wings up to one side, or wearing wings on his back. So we think it's probably like the hawk or a falcon. It's the primary bird that's being represented because they're very forceful, birds. Like the falcon, for instance, is the fastest bird in the sky, and it's the only one that hunts other birds in the sky. So it represents the warrior class, probably. But, again, the forces of the sun and the moon, their movements throughout the year are represented in the upper world along with birds. Then underworld is often represented by snakes and creatures that live underwater, fish, or then animals that can traverse, different realms. Like the beaver lives in the water, but also on the land. So they're often thought to have special powers. So some of these creatures are represented in the artwork that they produced. So it gives us clues about, some of their beliefs. But it's hard to know exactly what it was. But based on, again, what later Indian people were doing, we can draw some interpretations.
Were they pre-literate, or did they have any kind of writing?
No writing system, no. I think probably the only native peoples that had written languages were in Mexico, primarily the Mayan culture. But we don't see it in North America. They had symbols that stood for certain things and would be significant to them, but we don't always know what all those symbols mean. but there's not like a written language, you know.
What do we know about their family structures?
Well, we can base. We think the nuclear family was, you know, probably the basic unit, because that's when we see the houses that we excavate. They're, you know, just big enough for parents and children. You know, they're not like long houses that you see in New England or other places, but individual rectangular houses. So that's the basic family unit. But the clans would be very important. That would link, you know, people with shared mythical ancestry together. And there's, based on the way we see burials treated, indicates different social status in society. So we often say it's a ranked or hierarchical society with you know, very different classes of people within their society. There'd be leaders, or what some people call nobles or elites, who were, you know, kind of running the show. And then probably the clan leaders below them, and then the commoners below that. So the commoners are probably doing most of the manual labor. The others doing more of the administrative work, I guess, and coordinating and organizing different kinds of projects and activities. There would be priests who are in charge of regulating the ceremonies and rituals. There'd be also, you know, various craftspeople who are specialists in producing some of the more exotic ornaments and things like that. So there is some division of labor as well, and most likely there were gender-based roles in the society. You know, for instance, men doing most of the hunting and fishing, and probably the tilling the fields, and then women were probably doing more of the domestic work, cooking, raising children, making mats, and tending to the fields and harvesting the crops. So there are certainly gender-based duties, and probably the children were, you know, raised to learn these duties as based on their gender.
The objects that we found that are weapons, like what was their weaponry like?
Well, the bow and arrow is the primary weapon, and there are certain styles of arrowheads which identify this Mississippian culture, and what we often refer to as Cahokia points. They're usually triangular with two side notches and sometimes a third notch on the bottom, so they're fairly distinctive. And that style seems to kind of originate in this area and then spread to other areas. But the bow and arrow is the primary weapon. Of course, they would have knives, you know, flint knives, and war clubs, things like that. So, but those are the things they would often refer to as weapons. But they're also, you know, tools too.
So they were spreading out through trade networks. Who were some of their neighbors that they interacted with in North America? Well,
we base this somewhat on, you know, the kinds of materials and artifacts that we find that we know originate from other areas. I mentioned earlier that we get a lot of seashell that comes from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic coast. So they would be interacting with various, you know, tribal groups or other social groups in those areas. We're getting pottery that shows up here that we know comes from like Arkansas and Tennessee and Indiana and other places. So it shows that not only were they, you know, trading whatever was contained in those pots, but also probably some of those people are migrating or moving into this area as well. And there's been some new studies of some of the skeletal material to try and determine where people are coming from, or if they're local or non-local. And what we have found is probably 70% of the people are from the local area that lived here, but there's probably 30% or so that are foreign. You know, they come from other places, and this is based on some of the isotopes and things they can identify in the skeletal material. So it became a cosmopolitan area, I guess, where people were coming to Cahokia from distant places. They were trading with us from these distant places as well. We're getting a lot of, for instance, there was some tribute associated with a burial of a man who was probably one of the early leaders of Cahokia, including over 1,000 arrowheads, and they're made out of flint that came from Wisconsin and Missouri and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Tennessee and Illinois. So we know they had contacts with all these different areas. And we often see Cahokia-related materials at some of those distant locations as well. So it's going both ways.
Are there any other cities in the United States that were built by these people that maybe they weren't as big as Cahokia, but, you know, were larger than what you would typically see?
Yes, some of the other major sites, there's Angel Mounds in Evansville, Indiana. There's Moundville, Alabama, just south of Tuscaloosa. There's Etowah Mounds in northwestern Georgia. Astalan up in Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, just to name a few. So yeah, there are a number of these, you know, large Mississippian communities that are probably regional centers.
What do we know about the downfall of Cahokia and when it stopped being the power center that it was?
It looks like, based on more recent research, that this decline, at least in population, probably begins in the 1200s, and by the mid-1300s the site was essentially abandoned. But the reasons for it, there's probably many of them, but rather than any one factor, it doesn't appear to be a disaster that wipes them out, but it seems to be a gradual decline, and changing in the way the community functioned too, changing from a big population center maybe to more of a ceremonial center. But even that declines through time. And so we think some of the factors involved were depletion of resources in the area. The thousands of people here at Cahokia, and you can double that number if you include all the other surrounding communities. So if you got 10 to 20,000 people here, and you maybe have 40,000 in the general area within about a 30-40 mile radius, and so they're probably using up a lot of the wood resources, the animal life they depended on for food. There's some indications that there are changes in political structure. That there's more evidence of conflict and warfare after the mid-1100s or so. That's when they start building those stockade walls. There's also some climate changes that are starting to occur in the 1200s and become increasingly sort of a cooling trend in the environment, and this would affect eventually their crops as well as the natural flora and the fauna they depended upon. And there's also some accumulating evidence now for some extended droughts that occurred in the 11 and 1200s that certainly would affect their agriculture as well as, again, the natural flora and the fauna. So probably after a period of time that, as they're becoming, resources are becoming more scarce, or there's more challenges to Cahokia's authority, and the system begins to break down, and they eventually disperse. We just don't know where they all went or what tribes they became that we might know by name, from later times. Mm-hmm. But we're looking more and more at some of the groups that might have some kind of connection, at least to Mississippian and maybe Cahokia, people like the Osage, the Ponca, the Omaha.
Oh, wow.
So in their oral traditions, they one time were in this general area, and they feel they've got a connection to Cahokia. And they do have a lot of the same kind of symbolism and motifs and things that we see with the Mississippian culture. So there may be something to that. But right now, it's very difficult to ascertain just who the direct descendants are, and probably it's many different groups that have some kind of connection.
Cahokia is the largest city that was north of Mexico during its time. Why do you think that most people, more Americans, I would say, don't know about it?
That's a good question, and one we're often asked. Why don't we know more about this? I often tell people, well, if we had stone pyramids instead of earthen ones, people would know about us. But something.
I think that's probably true.
Something about piles of dirt that aren't as exciting as piles of stone. And it's not that we haven't, tried to get the word out, and we've been, covered in National Geographic magazine, Smithsonian Channel, History Channel, Travel Channel, all the cable TVs have done specials about Cahokia or included us as part of other programs that were about the prehistoric North America. So it's not as if the publicity has been out. For some reason, it just doesn't stick with people. And I think a lot of people have this sort of bias, assuming that there was no high culture here in North America, north of Mexico. But obviously, we did have something going on here that was very significant.
After the city was abandoned, what was kind of the history after, as far as, who was interacting with the site? When did it start being talked about again as an archaeological place?
Well, after Cahokia was abandoned, there seems to be a sort of a hiatus of occupation in this area, but later in the 1600s, there were other Indians that moved into this area. In fact, the name Cahokia comes from a later group. They were one of the sub-tribes of the Illinois Nation. The Cahokia and the Kaskaskia and the Peoria, Michigami, and a few others were sort of a loose confederacy that used to be up in the Great Lakes area, but during the fur trade area, they got pushed south and conflicts with other Indians. So we do know that those people were living in this area, at least in the 1600s. And then the French arrived in 1699, established a village next to one of the Cahokia settlements, and named their town Cahokia. At that time, they were living beside each other. Then, at some point in time, about 1730s, they started to have some problems with the Cahokia and decided to move them away from town. This is the French were doing this, and they actually moved them up here to our site and built a chapel for them on the first terrace of Monk's Mound, and that's probably where their village was moved onto that first terrace. We found evidence of that up there in some of our excavations. Then later in the early 1800s, there were some French priests and brothers, Trappist monks, that lived here on the site. And in fact, the name Monk's Mound is based on them. They planted gardens and fruit trees and wheat on the different terraces of the big mound. And apparently did have plans to build a monastery on top, but because of illness and other problems and financial difficulties, they eventually left before they accomplished that. But they were here from 1809 to 1813. And so they, mentioned, something about the mounds in some of their letters. But it really wasn't until the mid-1800s that historians started taking interest in mounds. There was a lot of debate about who built the mounds, whether it was Indians or whether it was a different culture called the mound builders that the Indians wiped out, and that the myth of the mound builders still exists in some people's minds, but we now know that all the mounds were built by the American Indians. But then there were people who started a movement to help preserve the mounds in the late 1800s, early 1900s, trying to get a state park or a national park of some kind. And eventually there were some archaeological excavations by Warren King Moorhead in the 1920s that confirmed that the mounds were actually man-made and not natural formations. And eventually the state acquired the first property in the 1925 period. And over the years, have increased the holdings, and we now own about 2,200 acres, the state of Illinois, and it includes about 70 of the mounds that were once here. A lot of the mounds were plowed down by farming activity, or subdivisions and discount stores and highways and things impacted other mounds, but we're fortunate to have as many surviving as we do. And so this is a state historic site now, and we have a large interpretive center here. We have excavations going on almost every summer. Really heavy concentration of archaeology began in the 1960s, partly due to the construction of Interstate 55 and 70 through our site, before we had some of the laws that kind of make it more difficult to build through here. That stimulated the interest in Cahokia, and ever since then there's been something going on just about every summer.
Wow, that's amazing. If listeners wanted to come and dig and help you guys, what would they do?
Well, we have a public program it's supported by our Cahokia Mounds Museum Society, which is our main support group here. And they have a program set up and directed by Dr. John Kelly out of Washington University in St. Louis. They've been focusing on reopening an old excavation that was done into a mound back in the 1950s by an amateur archaeologist and trying to learn more about that mound. And also following the route of the stockade wall on the northern and northeastern part of our site, trying to better determine just where it ran and so exactly how much area was enclosed by this wall. So that involves doing excavation and mapping and sifting and washing and sorting artifacts from the excavation. So people can sign up for that. Some of them do it for a few days or a week. We usually ask that they try and do it for at least 1 week, but it runs for about 6 weeks during the summer. And we have information about that. It's on our website, which is www.cahokiamounds.org. They click on the button that says join, they'll find information and an application that explains the project.
That sounds amazing. I wish that I'd known more about that when I had free time in North America. As far as, some of the things that are going on, what kind of events and things do you guys do?
Well, we have a lot of events throughout the year. For instance, coming up, we have Kids Day, with lots of hands-on activities for actually people of all ages, including making arrowheads and pinch pots and throwing spears with an atlatl, face painting, corn grinding, Indian games, lots of other things. That's one of our bigger events of the year. Then we have Archaeology Day, the first Saturday in August, with people demonstrating a lot of ancient crafts. People can help wash artifacts from the dig and actually tour the digs. And we also have a lecture series during the winter months, and we have storytelling programs. We've got several Indian art shows. We have about 30 American Indian artists from across the country that come here each year. We have in the spring, in the summer, and the fall. And a lot of it's, really fine art. It's not just crafts, but it's really amazing to see some of the skilled artists. And these are Indians they have to be, have a tribal card to participate, so we know it's authentic material. And they're from all over the country that come here and participate in these events. So, and we have observations of the equinox and solstice sunrises at the reconstructed Woodhenge. Again, we have the excavations going on in the summer. And we have guided tours twice a day during the summer months and on weekends in the spring and fall. So those are some of the major things that we do.
Excellent. Those all sound really fun. And my sister's in St. Louis, so next time I am in St. Louis, I'm going to have to schedule it around some kind of event out at Cahokia, because that sounds amazing.
Yeah, and we do have that calendar events on our website as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll put the link to the excavations, and we'll also put the link to the event calendar in the show notes so you guys can find it. And then we'll also put a link to your book, so that I highly encourage listeners, if you want to learn more but aren't in the greater St. Louis region, to go ahead and buy the book on Amazon.
That'd be great. Yeah, we also have an excellent gift shop here, so we do sell them through the gift shop.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your time so much. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me today, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you much.
I want to say thank you again to Bill for coming on the show and for being my very first interview. If you're ever in the St. Louis area, I highly recommend making the drive out to explore the mounds and learn more about the history of pre-Columbian North America, especially because as it's one of the U.S.'s UNESCO World Heritage Sites, it really is a can't miss, and it doesn't take a whole day. You can do so much of it in, 2, 3, 4 hours. Some show updates. So, huge, big news. Spotify has accepted the show, which means that in the next week and a half or so, The show will be available to stream on Spotify, including all the back episodes. And Spotify is notorious for rejecting independent podcasts when you submit them to be in their app. So I'm extremely grateful that they got the show and liked it and want to make it available to a wider audience. So if you or loved one use Spotify in about a week and a half, check, and it should be there. This also means that I'm pretty sure that the show is now available everywhere that someone could choose to listen to the show. iTunes, Android, YouTube, Spotify, Acast, Pocket Casts, SoundCloud, etc., etc., etc. But if you have a way that you like to listen to podcasts and we don't appear there, shoot me an email and I'll try to get it fixed. If you're an iTunes listener, it would be so lovely if you could rate and review the show. I know the great reviews you guys have given us so far is helping new people find the show every week. So I want to thank you. If you've reviewed the show, thank you so much. And if you use iTunes and you haven't reviewed it yet, it would be wonderful if you could go in and rate and review. Let's do a little travel update. So I just got back from my huge Romania trip that I talked about at the end of the Grand Bazaar episode. I saw 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites while I was there. I saw the Churches of Moldavia, which is a series site of 8 gorgeous painted Byzantine monasteries. I got to see 2 of them. I put a video up on my Facebook page of the churches, which already has 40,000 views. If you want to see what these gorgeous churches are like, you can go to my Facebook page. I also have pictures of it up on Instagram. And then the other UNESCO site I saw was Sighișoara, which is a town in Transylvania. And it's famous for a lot of reasons and it's protected as a UNESCO site for some specific historical reasons. But you would most likely be interested right now in the fact that it is where Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, the real live Dracula, where he was born. And I was standing outside of the building where he was born. A couple of my friends actually went in where he was born, and they said it was pretty hilarious. It was all decked out in Halloween stuff. Being in Transylvania around Halloween was pretty special. I plan on doing episodes about the painted monasteries, also about Transylvania. Hopefully I'm going to record it in a few weeks, so in the next month or two, both of those episodes will be out. So what I'm doing right now, travel-wise, is I'll be spending the next month in Sofia at my apartment with my dog, getting a bunch of episodes recorded, getting caught up on a bunch of other things. And also I just generally need to take a pause on the travel for a couple weeks and just sit still. I went to my nail salon today and that was lovely. Instead of trying to find one on the road, there's some things that you can't do on the road quite as well as you can do at home. And I know a girl from Oklahoma who lived in Philly, who moved to Bulgaria in February on a tourist visa. It's weird to call Sofia home, but Sofia it very much feels like home, and it's really great to be back here and just pause for a week or a month. Sofia is where my dog is, so where my dog is usually where home is. So I'll be here, but then in December, I'm going on like a huge bucket list trip to Tunisia. I'm going to Tunisia for 2 weeks to see Carthage. I'm obsessed with the Punic Wars. I have a feeling a lot of you guys are obsessed with the Punic Wars too. If there's anything, questions, or any places in Tunisia you specifically want me to go, email me, hit me up on Facebook or Instagram. And then in January, I'm going to be doing my first trip to Southeast Asia, and I'm doing 4 weeks. I'm going to try to hit 14 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. We'll see how that actually works. And I'm going to go into Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Malaysia, trying to get to Vietnam, and maybe like a day in Singapore. So it's going to be like a huge, crazy, frantic trip. And if there is a historic site in one of those countries or a historic event in one of those countries you really want me to cover, please shoot me an email now while I'm working on my itinerary. I will try to fit it in. Definitely want to hit the killing fields in Cambodia. Definitely want to learn more about the Vietnam War and what happened at the Hanoi Hilton when I'm in Hanoi. There's some really amazing temples. Obviously, I'm going to go into Angkor Wat and Angkor, and I'm going to try to spend a couple days there. I'm super excited. I've never been to Southeast Asia before. The only places in Asia I've actually been are Israel and Jordan, and definitely not going to be the same as Southeast Asia. So I'm really, I guess I've been to the Asia side of Turkey, but that doesn't really count. So if you have questions about places you want me to check out in Tunisia or Thailand or Cambodia or Laos or Vietnam or Malaysia or Singapore, contact me. If you want pictures from my travels as I'm traveling, hit me up on Instagram or Facebook. I'm History Fangirl on both of those platforms. If you want to see a lot of angry political retweets, you can find me on Twitter at @HistoryFangirl, because someone had History Fangirl, even though she doesn't use it, which is super annoying. And I know this was a lot of housekeeping last week. We didn't do any. So thank you so much for listening to the show. Rate and review it. And thanks for listening.